The following content contains real events involving criminal behavior, including descriptions of violence and mature themes. It is intended for a mature audience and may be disturbing to some viewers.
Rebekah Gould's childhood was filled with many happy moments, despite the unfortunate hardship that accompanied her parents' divorce. Rebekah was always swimming in the lakes and rivers, catching crawdads, and she loved to camp during the summer. These outdoor activities provided Rebekah with a taste of freedom. She and her sisters spent countless hours enjoying the tranquility of nature. Although Rebekah was physically small in stature, she possessed a larger-than-life personality. Despite her diminutive appearance, she had a remarkable ability to face challenges head-on without fear. Rebekah was fiercely protective of her family, particularly her sisters. She believed honesty was the best policy and valued integrity above everything else. Then came the Monday evening when Rebekah failed to pick up her sister Danielle for their trip back to school. Danielle was not particularly worried. Although she loved her sibling, she knew that Rebekah was not the most dependable person in the world. However, when Danielle and her other sisters still had not heard from Rebekah the following day, they grew concerned. As it would turn out, there was good reason to worry. Rebekah didn't have the most stable childhood. When her parents Larry and Shirley divorced, she and her sisters, Gabrielle, Tiffany, and Danielle, went to live with their mother. During the divorce proceedings, things between Larry and Shirley became contentious, with both sides hurling nasty allegations at one another. Larry later said he worried about his daughters because Shirley moved them all around the state, and they lacked stability. Despite their difficulties, the four sisters formed an unbreakable bond, with Rebekah as their guiding light. In September 2004, Rebekah, then 22, along with her sister Danielle and their dog, planned a visit to their hometown of Mountain View, Arkansas. During this visit, Rebekah planned to stay with her friend Casey McCullough. Rebekah and Danielle planned to spend the weekend in Mountain View and then drive back to Fayetteville on Monday, September 20th, to prepare for classes the following day. When Rebekah failed to pick up her sister Danielle, she made a call to the local police department. Danielle requested that they conduct a welfare check on Rebekah, who had been staying with her friend Casey. Casey worked at the fast food restaurant, Sonic. The police officer assigned to the case initially thought this would be a routine call. However, it would turn out to be anything but ordinary. The officer arrived at Sonic and started to question Casey. Casey informed the officer that he had last seen Rebekah the day before when she had dropped him off at Sonic for his morning shift. Casey explained to the officer that Rebekah was supposed to return to drive him home in the afternoon, but she never arrived. Rebekah's absence did not surprise Casey, as he had a hunch that Rebekah might have decided to pack up and drive back to Fayetteville early. According to Casey, as he was waiting for Rebekah in the Sonic parking lot, two friends approached him and invited him to hang out with them. Casey accepted the offer and went to the movie with his friends. Afterward, he spent the night at their house. The officer asked Casey if he would accompany him back to his house to check if Rebekah was there. Casey agreed, and the officer followed Casey home. Upon arriving at his house, the officer noticed Rebekah's car parked in Casey's driveway. This discovery was concerning to the officer, as it seemed unlikely for Rebekah to leave without her car. Inside the house, the officer discovered more troubling signs that Rebekah did not leave of her own accord. The officer found her purse, keys, and several other personal items. As they continued their search, the officer asked Casey to take him to the room where Rebekah had been sleeping. Casey explained that he and Rebekah, who had been in an on-again, off-again relationship, were sleeping in his bedroom. The officer followed Casey to the bedroom, where he noticed Casey's bed was stripped of linen. He asked Casey if it was okay for him to flip the mattress, and Casey agreed. As the officer lifted the mattress, he saw a large blood stain. The discovery of the blood stain on the bare mattress prompted the officer to take additional steps. He checked the laundry to see if the sheets had been placed there. Inside the washing machine, the officer found the bloody sheets. Since the officer discovered blood, he called for backup and removed Casey from his residence. Casey's house was then secured as a crime scene. Crime scene investigators arrived at Casey's residence. Upon entering his bedroom, they discovered more bloody evidence, including stained pillows and clothing stuffed under the bed. The investigators meticulously collected and transported all the evidence to the crime lab for testing and analysis. Meanwhile, Rebekah's sisters were preparing to give Rebekah a lecture about her sudden disappearance. While they were worried about her safety, Tiffany, Rebekah's sister, remained optimistic. She believed that Rebekah had gotten caught up in partying and would show up eventually. Rebekah had always been the last to leave a party, as she was known for her boundless energy and love for having fun. Casey was taken to the police department, where a detective questioned him regarding Rebekah's disappearance. He explained that it was on a Sunday and Rebekah had been at his house. They had spent the evening watching movies. In the middle of their evening, Casey's cousin arrived on the property, and Casey stepped out to talk to him for a few minutes before returning to the house. According to Casey, he and Rebekah went upstairs to bed after his cousin left. They woke up the next morning, and Rebekah drove him to work. That was the last time he saw her. While Casey denied any involvement in Rebekah's disappearance, he suggested that the detectives should investigate Justin Gould, Rebekah's high school sweetheart. In 2004, Justin was having a baby with someone else. Despite this, the two had been in contact before Rebekah disappeared. Inside Rebekah's purse, an investigator finds a letter from Justin in which he writes how much he loves her and thinks they belong together. An analyst at the crime lab performed a DNA test on the bloody evidence recovered from Casey's house, and the results came back as a match to Rebekah. By this point, Rebekah's family had been notified that they should meet with a detective. The detective shared his suspicions that she may not have left Casey's house of her own free will. He also emphasized the amount of blood found at Casey's house. This news came as a devastating blow to Rebekah's loved ones, who had initially held out hope that she had lost track of time while partying. However, Rebekah's family refused to give up hope. They continued to pray that she was still out there, possibly injured or in pain, but alive. By Wednesday, the third day of Rebekah's disappearance, a full-scale search was launched. Search and rescue teams, consisting of professionals from various organizations, scoured the miles of national forests in the area on foot, horseback, and four-wheelers. The effort was extensive, involving not only members of the National Forest Service but also game and fish wardens, volunteer fire departments, and other law enforcement agencies. As the search continued, detectives made attempts to contact Rebekah's ex-boyfriend, Justin. However, they initially found it difficult to reach him. On Wednesday, Justin finally answered his phone. He told the detectives he had been at the casino with his father. When the detective asked Justin if Rebekah was with him, he said no. Eventually, the detective verified Justin's alibi, and he was cleared as a suspect in Rebekah's disappearance. By the end of the week of Rebekah's disappearance, a body was discovered on the side of a mountain highway about 30 feet down an embankment. This area was rural, with low vehicle traffic and no nearby residences or businesses. Despite the state of decomposition, the detectives believed the body found was Rebekah. Larry, Rebekah's father, was a dentist, and he met with detectives at the police department to provide her dental records. An expert at the state crime lab examined the deceased woman's teeth and determined that they were a match with Rebekah's. When Rebekah's family was told this devastating news, they were stunned. It didn't feel real to them. During Rebekah's autopsy, the medical examiner determined her cause of death as blunt force trauma to the face and head. He classified her death as a homicide. It was challenging for Rebekah's sisters to plan her funeral, as the weight of their loss weighed heavily on their hearts. They had been together, standing side by side, their entire lives, and now one of them was gone forever. The absence of Rebekah's vibrant presence loomed large, making it difficult for them to fathom life without her. Despite these obstacles, they eventually made a decision. They chose a pink and purple casket as a tribute to Rebekah's favorite color and bright personality. It was a fitting choice, symbolizing her lively spirit. It would be an understatement to say that the funeral service was an emotional affair. Meanwhile, at Casey's home, investigators noticed a piano in the living room, and upon closer examination, they discovered that one of the legs was missing. Casey, whom the detectives were interviewing, explained that the leg had been loose and would frequently fall out of place when someone stepped on a certain area of the floor. However, Casey admitted that he had no idea where the leg was. As the investigation continued into the murder of Rebekah, suspicions surrounding Casey McCullough began to grow. All of the blood evidence collected at the scene of the crime had originated from Casey's home, specifically from his bed. Despite this, Casey maintained his innocence and denied having any involvement in Rebekah's murder. He expressed a willingness to cooperate with the police and answer their questions. During the investigation, Casey was interviewed on various topics related to Rebekah. According to Casey, he and Rebekah had met at Sonic. Casey described her as the most beautiful creature he had ever seen, claiming that he had been captivated by her from the moment he first laid eyes on her. The detectives questioned Casey's co-workers at Sonic, and they confirmed that Casey had been present for his shift from 8:30 a.m. until 4 p.m. on Monday, the day Rebekah was killed. Furthermore, the two men whom Casey claimed to have been with after work the night Rebekah was murdered corroborated his story. These men said that they went to the movies with Casey and then returned to one of their houses to sleep. With Casey's alibi seemingly confirmed, the detectives began considering other possible suspects in Rebekah's murder. They turned their attention to Casey's relatives, who had access to the house. Initially, they focused on Claude McCullough, Casey's father, a truck driver. However, upon further investigation, the detectives learned that Claude was out on a training route in Kentucky at the time of the murder. Detectives then turned their attention to Casey's brothers, Randy, Chris, and Corey. However, despite extensive scrutiny, the detectives were unable to establish a connection between the siblings and Rebekah's murder. In their efforts to piece together the events surrounding Rebekah's death, detectives extended their investigation to Casey's cousin Billy Miller, who had visited his house the night before Rebekah was killed. By the time the detectives got around to questioning Billy Miller, he had left Arkansas and returned home to Texas. After law enforcement officers in Texas interviewed Billy, the detectives working on Rebekah's murder concluded that he had no involvement. As the days turned into weeks and weeks turned into months, the detectives found themselves facing mounting frustration and a growing sense of hopelessness. Despite their best efforts, they were unable to find any substantial leads or evidence pointing towards a possible perpetrator. Because the detectives had gathered evidence indicating that Rebekah had been communicating with her high school boyfriend Justin, who had a child, they began to ponder whether the mother of Justin's baby might be involved in Rebekah's murder. Rebekah's sisters also entertained the possibility that the woman, Jennifer Turner, might have been the culprit. When the detectives questioned Jennifer Turner, she denied harming Rebekah and said that they were close friends. The detectives, however, did verify Jennifer's alibi, which proved that she was in Conway, 70 miles away from Mountain View at the time Rebekah was murdered. With the confirmation of Jennifer Turner's alibi and the absence of any evidence linking her to the crime, the detectives were able to clear her of suspicion. Another individual that the detectives investigated as a suspect in Jennifer's murder was J.B. Yates. J.B., who sometimes engaged in small-scale cannabis sales, had established a working relationship with Rebekah. Through interviews with various witnesses, the detectives learned that Rebekah owed J.B. $20. This debt raised suspicions within the investigative team, as it led them to wonder if J.B. had murdered Rebekah as retaliation for the money she owed him. J.B. categorically denied having any involvement in Rebekah's murder. He said she paid him the money she owed days before she was killed. However, as the nature of the transaction involved illicit drugs, J.B. was unable to provide any concrete documentation to prove their settlement. Having exhausted their line of inquiry with J.B. Yates, the detectives turned their attention to another man named Chris Cantrell. Chris had garnered a reputation for being intimidating around town. It was rumored that he was boasting to acquaintances about being involved in Rebekah's murder. Although the detectives believed that Chris was a viable suspect in the murder of Rebekah based on his violent history, they ultimately failed to find any concrete evidence connecting him to the crime. 14 years after Rebekah was murdered, true crime writer and private investigator Catherine Townsend started a podcast, Hell and Gone, about Rebekah's unsolved murder. The podcast aimed to uncover new leads and shed light on the case. As Catherine delved into the details of the murder, she received a shocking phone call from a man who claimed to have valuable information. The man claimed that his co-worker, Casey McCullough, had confessed to murdering Rebekah. According to this man, Casey confided to him about murdering Rebekah as they were working on repairing cell phone towers. Casey allegedly told his co-workers that Rebekah had said offensive things to him when he asked her out, which angered him. The argument escalated, and Casey lost his temper. In a moment of rage, he attacked and killed Rebekah. When the detectives learned about the co-worker's disclosure to Catherine Townsend for the podcast, they called him for a formal interview. During the interview, the man confirmed that Casey confessed to murdering Rebekah. However, he claimed that this revelation had taken place approximately 8 years prior, in 2010. The detectives were puzzled by the man's delay in coming forward with this information. As part of their investigation, the detectives delved into the background of this co-worker. The detectives discovered that Casey had once had a sexual relationship with the man's wife. Upon hearing this information, the detectives began to suspect that the co-worker's motive for disclosing information about Rebekah's murder may have been driven by revenge. However, when questioned by Dateline, the man stated that his wife and Casey had never had a romantic relationship. He added that Casey had confessed to murdering Rebekah. In January 2020, a cold case detective with the Arkansas State Police began to again investigate Rebekah's murder. The detective conducted another interview with Casey. After the interview concluded, the detective felt convinced that Casey was not involved in this crime. However, the detective had suspicions that someone from Casey's family, who had access to his home, had murdered Rebekah. The detectives decided to interview Casey's brothers. 2 of them were cleared of any involvement, but the youngest brother, Corey, could not recall his whereabouts on the day of the murder. Since the detective was convinced that Rebekah's body was transported from Casey's house to a ravine in a vehicle, he found the car Corey was driving in 2004. When the detective questioned Corey regarding his involvement in Rebekah's murder, the detective decided to lie, which the Supreme Court deemed illegal. The detective informed Corey that his DNA had been found on a bloody cloth that was stuffed under Casey's bed. Additionally, the detective mentioned that upon locating his vehicle, forensic tests revealed Rebekah's DNA in the cab of his old car, which they tracked down. However, Corey adamantly denied the possibility of this, stating that it was impossible. Eventually, the detective began to doubt Corey's guilt. The detective realized it was time to investigate other people who had access to Casey's home. This line of inquiry ultimately led back to Casey's cousin, Billy Miller. In 2004, the detectives working on Rebekah's murder case determined that Billy was not a viable suspect. However, in 2020, the detective came across some interesting information. It was discovered that 2 years before Rebekah's murder, Billy had been the prime suspect in an aggravated sexual assault case. However, he was never charged. As the detective delved deeper into Billy Miller's history, they discovered that in 2010 he was arrested for allegedly elbowing his ex-wife as he tried to force his way into their home in Texas. The charges were eventually dismissed. In 2020, when Billy Miller became the focus of the investigation into Rebekah's murder, he was married with a family and living in the Philippines working on an offshore oil rig. He was 44 years old. Detectives learned Billy Miller had been active on a Facebook page made in the name of justice for Rebekah. Billy provided several theories as to what could have happened to Rebekah and expressed his sympathy for the family on the page. To monitor Billy Miller's movements, the detectives placed a flag on his passport to ensure that United States Customs agents would alert them if he entered the United States. In October 2020, the detective was informed by U.S. Customs that Billy Miller had returned to the United States and was in Oregon. Upon further investigation, the detective discovered that Billy's mother resided in Oregon. The detective contacted her to see if Billy was in the States. Billy's mother confirmed the news that Billy was in Oregon. The detective promptly made an appointment to meet with Billy in person and to talk about Rebekah's murder. During the interview with Billy, the detective adopted a cautious approach, not wanting to spook or place excessive pressure on him. The detective's strategy was to gain Billy's trust and gather as much information as possible without overwhelming him. Despite not recovering the suspect's DNA from the crime scene, the detective devised a plan to deceive Billy and mislead him, claiming the investigators had obtained a male DNA profile. When the detectives told Billy this, he became visibly nervous. The detective asked Billy for a sample of his DNA so they could compare it to the victim and exclude him as a suspect. However, Billy said he was not willing to hand over his DNA. Confronted with the possibility of the suspect's DNA being found at the crime scene, Billy changed his story about being at Casey's house, and now claimed he had been inside Casey's house 2 times in the past. Furthermore, Billy recalled that right before Rebekah was killed, His mother had given Casey furniture, including his bed and sheets, so there was the possibility that his DNA was there too. Although Billy would not hand over his DNA for comparison to the victims, he did agree to take a polygraph test. Billy was apprehensive and asked if the polygraph could be used as evidence against him in court if he failed. He appeared nervous as he made the request. The test lasted 45 minutes, and the polygrapher determined that Billy had been deceptive. Once the detective knew that Billy had failed the polygraph, he decided to confront him. The detective told Billy that they had tracked down the car he had owned in 2004, and investigators had conducted forensics tests on it and found Rebekah's DNA on the gas pedal. However, that was untrue, but Billy did not know that this information was being fabricated. Eventually, Billy confessed to the detective that on early Monday morning, September 20th, 2004, he had been hunting on his cousin Casey's property. While on his hunting expedition, he noticed a blond man with gloves on the porch. The man then sped away in a car. When Billy entered his cousin's house, he discovered that Rebekah was lying dead in Casey's bed. However, shortly after making that statement, Billy asked the detective if he could speak to his mother. After talking to his mom, Billy informed the detective that he was now ready to tell the whole truth about what happened on the day Rebekah was murdered. According to Billy, he had prior knowledge of his cousin Casey having a female friend in his house. During a visit to Casey's house the night before, Billy learned that Rebekah was visiting. Billy told detectives that he went to Casey's house when he knew Rebekah would be alone. When Rebekah answered the door, Billy said he introduced himself as Casey's cousin and asked to come inside to use the phone. However, this was just a ruse to gain entry into the house. Once inside, Billy paced around the kitchen, and while doing so, he noticed that the piano leg fell off the piano. According to Billy, the piano leg caught his attention, and at that moment he had an idea. He decided that this piano leg would serve as the murder weapon. In a rage, Billy followed Rebekah into Casey's bedroom, where she was lying on the bed, falling asleep. Without hesitation, Billy struck Rebekah in the head with the piano leg, repeatedly hitting her until the leg broke apart. Although Billy confessed he went to Casey's house to murder Rebekah, he stressed to the detective that the crime was not sexually motivated. Billy said after hitting Rebekah with the piano leg he strangled her with a men's tie. He further confessed to carrying Rebekah's body into his vehicle and driving to a ravine, where he disposed of her after cleaning up the crime scene. After confessing to Rebekah's murder, Billy was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. During Billy's confession, he revealed that he had taken Rebekah's suitcase with him at the time of the murder. In 2020, Billy led the police to where he had disposed of Rebekah's suitcase. The suitcase was still there, the one piece of solid evidence connecting Billy Miller to Rebekah's murder. Ultimately, Billy Miller took a plea deal with the state and was sentenced to 40 years for Rebekah's murder. Rebekah's family welcomed this sentence, as it meant that Billy would be unable to cause harm to others in the future. The severity of the punishment provided a sense of closure and justice for Rebekah's family. The loss of Rebekah had a profound effect on her father. Larry is determined to establish Rebekah's law to honor her memory and bring about positive change. Under Rebekah's law, Larry aims to enable family members of homicide victims to access their case files after a specified number of years have passed without any significant progress being made in the case. Larry believes that granting access to the files would provide closure and a sense of justice for the victims and their families, enabling them to better understand the investigation and legal proceedings. Larry's proposal would also ensure that victims and their families are not left in the dark or forced to wait for a resolution. By allowing access to the case files, families would be able to stay informed about the progress of the case, maintain a sense of control, and advocate for justice on behalf of their loved ones. Rebekah's law would serve as a significant step towards promoting transparency within the legal system and honoring the memories of those affected by violent crimes. Larry's advocacy for this legislation is a testament to his unwavering commitment to ensuring justice and seeking closure for families who have experienced the tragic loss of a loved one. Now, we want to hear from you. What do you think about this case? Can't wait for more? Click the link above to learn about the horrific murder of a family taken at the hands of a child in The Deadly Retreat. Stay curious, stay connected, stay with Reely on Real.